Welcome to First Issues. It is only a few days from the 2025-2026 national budget announcement, where the Minister of Finance and Economic Development, His Excellency the Vice President of Botswana, Ndaba, will be making his inaugural national budget speech. This follows a rather shocking turn of events at the 2024 general elections, where the Botswana Democratic Party was voted out of power after almost 6 decades of rule. This power shift saw Umbrella for Democratic Change becoming the government of the day, led by His Excellency the President, Advocate Duma Boko. Well, from this victory, Botswana are waiting to see how several issues of national concern will be tackled. Amongst them, the escalating unemployment rates, the dwindling government coffers, infrastructure development, the economic diversification drive, to mention but a few. As is norm, First Issues had a dialogue with industry captain, economist and managing director at Economist Dr Keith Jefferis to get his thoughts on what he anticipates the budget would look like, or at the very least, what he believes government should be focusing on in this new budget. Dr. Jefferis, thank you so much for coming on First Issues. We're here to talk to you about your expectations for the upcoming national budget. So perhaps we could start off by you rounding up the 2024-25 national budget and maybe share your concerns about what your concerns with it were.
Yeah, so we had the 2024-25 budget back in February, and I think at the time, look, it was a pre-election budget. And I think that was very apparent. So the budget was what we would say was very expansionary. There was a big increase in expenditure, with lots of money going to areas that's, you may think were sort of politically targeted. So there was extra money for youth programs, extra money for agriculture, extra money for the informal sector. Remember, there was the Chema Fund was set up, and it was originally funded for 200 million, then suddenly became 500 million. So there were those things. Then there was a lot of money for projects, development projects. So the development budget is normally about a quarter of the total budget. 20%, and there was a big increase in the funding for development projects. So I think at the time the concern was that this was very expansionary. It had a big budget deficit projected. There weren't nearly enough revenues coming in to pay for the spending. So I think one of the concerns was that firstly the spending there was a big increase, and we didn't have the revenue coming in to finance the spending. So a big deficit, a lot of borrowing required, new debt to finance the spending, and also that the spending was not very well targeted. In other words, the areas that were getting the extra money had not been well thought through as to their effectiveness, particularly on the development projects. So we were getting all sorts of new projects. They hadn't been through any kind of appraisal process or prioritization. And then this new development manager approach, which also involved a lot of extra expense, and hadn't been pilot tested or anything like that. So I think there was a lot of risk, and as I say, it had all the hallmarks of a pre-election spending spree.
Well, in spite of those thoughts, though, do you think that there were some merits to the 2024-25 budget that you think, if they were to be given a bit more time, they would translate to what they were intended to achieve?
Not without more preparation and more thought. So yes, we need, so for instance, on the project side, clearly, whether it's roads or water pipelines or schools, etc., we need some development. But you can't do those projects without preparation. So the way they entered into, they may have been intrinsically useful projects, but the way that they entered into the budget was wrong. And I think we actually need to go back to the drawing board on many of these things.
You were just talking about key priority areas, right? So with that in mind, what do you think should be the focal points for the 2025-26 national budget then?
Okay, so two things come to mind. One is that the overall budget, the level of spending relative to the level of revenues, need to be realistic. The numbers need to be realistic, and they need to be somewhat cautious, because diamond revenues, the market is still not recovered. We don't know when it's going to recover. People are now saying maybe second half of 2025, but on the revenue side, it's going to be another difficult year. And I think, overall, the level of spending has to be managed so that we're not continuing to run very large budget deficits. Remember, of course, that one of the consequences of last year's budget, particularly when there was no mid-year revision of the budget, I think that was one of the many mistakes that was made with last year's budget, was even when it became apparent that conditions were much worse than expected, government didn't go back and do a budget revision in the middle of the year, which is something that many countries do. And partly because there was no mid-year revision, as you will have heard, the government investment account, which is really the government savings account, was depleted. It was emptied. And so there's no more savings to use to finance budget deficits. So any deficits we have will have to be financed by borrowing, which means debt goes up. So the overall level of the budget has to be controlled in such a way that whatever deficit results, I'm sure there will be a deficit, but it needs to be relatively small and not ever increasing.